In the world before World War II, everything was imperial. You had a British system, a French system, and so on, and they competed for everything. And if you weren't one of those imperial systems, you were probably one of the pieces that was getting fought over. So technology did not advance all that quickly. Markets were small and segmented and fragmented, and there was always the looming risk of military conflict. Ultimately, that competition brought us World War II and the destruction that came with it. At the end of World War II, the Americans made an offer to most of what we now know as the advanced world for a different way of operating. We would patrol the global oceans so that anyone could go anywhere and interface with any partner and sell into any market, if in exchange everyone would line up with us to fight the Soviets in the Cold War. And it worked. And for the first time in human history, there was such a thing as a global market. And by combining all those little disparate pieces into a single global whole, whether it was an imperial center of the United States or a colony, everyone could access manufactured goods and energy and finance and global transport really for the first time. And everyone started to specialize. And in that specialization, we founded the value added that eventually brought us to the world we're in today, where products can cross the world in a matter of days and supply chains can have hundreds of steps with no risk, and yet people can still finance the purchases relatively easily. Now, that was certainly true back in 2019. Since COVID and the recovery from COVID, we are already moving into a deglobalized era. We're only at the very beginning of the end of what we've come to know. What the United States did is agree to indirectly or directly subsidize the economic growth of the rest of the world. And when the Cold War ended, we kept doing that. But we were no longer getting the strategic deference that we had during the Cold War. So from the American point of view, ever since 1992, the world has been kind of careening out of control. We're still paying the upkeep, but it has indirectly led to the rise of a number of countries that we're not exactly thrilled with. China's at the top of that list. And the return of countries that the whole idea of globalization in the first place was that strategic deal to box in the Soviet Union. And now the Russians are back. So we are now in the early stages of all those interconnections breaking down and countries, regions having to figure out how to go it alone. And for most, that will not be possible. Energy and food are not necessarily produced in the same places where you live. And if you break down global trade, we see cascading failures in absolutely every economic sector. Naval power was absolutely the biggest piece. There's actually an argument to be made now that even if the U.S. wanted to continue, it couldn't. We have shifted the way our Navy works over the last 30 years, and we're almost exclusively focused on projecting power through our carrier groups. We're going to have 14 of them by the end of the decade, and they're incredibly strong. That's how you knock off a country for sure. But if you want to patrol the global seas, you need destroyers, about 800 of them. We have 70. So there isn't a coalition of countries that could theoretically step in and take the Americans' place here. But there's another piece to it too. The rest of the world is not willing to defer to the United States on security matters, and that's the other half of the globalization equation. So whether it's from the point of view of the security provider or the consumer, this was always going to end, and now it is. Before World War II, transport was a little dicey. You had all these conflicting imperial systems, and you would either have to have de facto control over a body of water, or you would have to send your ships out to escort. And that meant there was limits on to how much could be shipped, and the cost was relatively high. You had to go fast to avoid foes at limited range. With globalization, that all went away. All the hostile navies of the world were sunk pretty much during World War II. The U.S. was one of the very few to survive, and then it was put to the service of the global commons so that anyone could put any product on a ship and have high confidence that would get to its end destination. Now, in the early days of this, as Europe was recovering from the war, as Japan was rebuilding, and then ultimately as the colonies were being freed, this started with the same basic stuff that we had during the imperial era: iron ore, food, oil, the basics. But as time went on, it became apparent that you could have more and more ships with more and more product on the float. We started getting into this crazy idea called intermediate good trades, where you would make a bumper for a car or a carburetor, and you just specialize in that one thing. And that specialization expanded the volume of what we would transport by an order of 3 orders of magnitude. And that brings us to the world we are today, where an iPhone has like 1,100 parts and 10,000 independent supply chain steps because the risk within the system is negligible. So everyone specializes in the specific thing. You shuttle intermediate products about, and then ultimately the final product will end up in your front door. That is something that is so far past what has been reality in human history as to almost be obnoxious. But this is our normal today. And as we're discovering, whether it's because of the Ukraine war or the China lockdowns or the Trump tariffs or Brexit, you disrupt one piece of one supply chain and you do not get an end product. So now we have to do all of this in screaming reverse, unspecialize, bring production supply chains closer to their end consumer, make them shorter, make them less energy intensive. And that means that roughly 2/3 of the people in the world that are in the sector of manufacturing no longer have a means to earn a living. That cascades through absolutely everything else. We've already seen the French, the Greeks, and the Brits start to confiscate vessels for Russian sanctions. We now have an insurance embargo on Russian crude, and the Russian state is offering sovereign indemnities, which is just like asking for NATO countries to start picking up a few of their tankers in order to crush the Russian economy and convince other countries to not play. We also no longer have sanctity of supply in China because of the COVID lockdowns. Shanghai was locked down for all of April, all of May, reopened on June 1. It's in the process of closing down again. Whether it's for health or for populism, or for trade, or for security, or for energy, or for interruptions in the actual flow of goods. This doesn't work anymore. And that means we have to rebuild the supply chains. And if we're going to rebuild them based on our own consumption needs, most of that is going to be internal. So the UK, once it figures out Brexit, will probably join the NAFTA alliance. We'll see what happens with Germany in a system where they can no longer access materials from Ukraine or Russia. That's going to be very difficult for them to change. But most of all, you've got this disconnect between supply and consumption. If you don't have a lot of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, you don't have the big bulk that allows modern consumption-driven systems to work. That means you can only play on the production side, on the export side. And that makes you very vulnerable to changes in anything in the international environment or changes in the political or economic environment of your ultimate consumers. So we're seeing this, what has been a flawless, frictionless system, face pressures from every point of the compass at every step of the supply system. You don't break up an old supply chain and build a new one in a period of demographic decline without massive inflation. And here we are. This is not a one-off. This is not a Biden thing. This is with us for years. Automation's great if you can afford it. When globalization hit, everyone could play at every part. And so we moved off of a subsistence living in agricultural zones into the cities where we took higher value-added manufacturing and service jobs. And when you move into the city, by necessity, you have a smaller living footprint, so you have fewer children. Also on the farm, kids are free labor, so you have a bunch. In the city, not so much. You play that forward for 70 years, and a lot of the world stopped having kids in large numbers 50 years ago. So we're now in this decade at a point where a lot of the advanced world, their last generation is moving into retirement. And when you have a mass retirement event like what is going on with the baby boomers right now, they change the way that their capital works, and they cash out their stocks and bonds, and they go to T-bills and cash. So we're going to have a financial shortage here as well. That's a real problem for automation. Automation is expensive to develop, to install, and everyone forgets the third step, to update whenever there's a change to the product set. That's the most expensive part of all. We just don't have the capital that we're going to have. So we need to retrain workforces, shrinking workforce environment. We need to relocate manufacturing assets in an environment of deglobalization. At the same time, we have to find enough capital to power all of this. So for countries that are more advanced in age, I'm thinking here Japan, Germany, Italy, I don't see how they pull that off. For younger ones, the UK, the United States, I can still see it working with automation. But it's just better to have another labor force that's proximate at a different price point with a different skill set. In the case of the United States, that's Mexico. So you can have limited automation and integration with the Mexican system and avoid most of these pressures. But most of the advanced world doesn't have that sort of option. The Germans have tried it. They're very good at automation, but their population is so far past